In this, our 12th lecture on the lessons that we learned for life from the great books, we continue our exploration of how we live our life, the various stages of our life. And we've progressed from youth to old age, but we want now to consider what happens when we suddenly decide, perhaps at any stage of our life, that we've made one big mistake. It used to be called something like a midlife crisis. And we've talked about Faust in our course, and one of my students once asked why we were reading Faust. It was about a middle-aged man having a midlife crisis and wanting to kill himself. Well, midlife crises are real things. And one of the most noble studies, and I believe enduring studies, of what we do when we realize we've made a mistake is Isaac Singer, The Penitent. And it asks with me the question, what is the good of living along our short life if we do not learn and if we do not grow intellectually, morally, spiritually, as a result of the life we live and the experiences that we have? I never assign a list of the great books that every individual should read, setting myself up as the absolute judge of whether you should read this book or that book. I think that you should read books that speak to you. And you'll remember in our first lecture, that's how we defined a great book ultimately, is that it speaks to you. And Singer, The Penitent, came to me in just that way, the best of all ways. I pulled it off of his shelf, knowing nothing about it, and sat for an hour glued to it on the floor. So moving did I find this story. Isaac Singer, the author of The Penitent, was born probably in 1902, you will sometimes see 1904, but in Poland, to a Jewish family. His father was a rabbi, a deeply devout man. And it was a very devout family in which Singer grew up. The Penitent, and the whole story of the Penitent, takes us back to that same rich Jewish culture that we explored when we talked about Elie Wiesel's Night. The Jewish people, in 64 AD, part of the Roman Empire, the Emperor Augustus had annexed Judea in 6 AD. They were at a prosperous period. The Middle East had never been more stable, more prosperous than under Roman rule. And the Romans tried to ensure law and justice throughout their vast empire. And most of the people of that empire, from the Gauls all the way out to the Syrians, from the north shores of the North Sea all the way to the sands of the Sahara, accepted Roman rule. But the Jewish people, in the name of freedom, rose up in a great revolt. And they believed that Israel was a sacred nation, just as sacred as it had been when Moses was called by God to lead them out of Egypt. And they rose up again under the Romans to liberate themselves and to make God their only king. One trouble, though, when you start an insurgency against the Romans, unlike some other nations, they saw it through to the end. And once you had risen up, there was no escaping Roman justice. And the Romans put down the revolt of the Jews with absolute brutality. The general Titus, son of the Emperor Vespasian, captured the city of Jerusalem. Hundreds of thousands of Jews had been killed fighting for freedom. Hundreds of thousands more were sent all over the empire to be slaves, to die in the arena for the amusement of a Roman crowd. The temple itself in 70 AD was destroyed, and the sacred implements of Judaism were brought back in triumph to Rome. And the Jewish people could have disappeared from history. The temple had been the center of their worship, and their God had been defeated, so the Romans viewed it. And in fact, later on, the Emperor Hadrian would establish where the temple had once been, a Roman shrine to the god Jupiter. And they were dispersed. Some stayed on in what we call Israel today, but others had already dispersed to areas throughout the Roman Empire, and now they were ever more dispersed. And so they lived in exile, generation after generation, hoping that next year they would be in Jerusalem. But it never came. And wherever they went, they kept their Judaism. And their Jewishness was preserved by their book, the Bible, and by their learned teachers, the rabbis. And with the temple gone, the rabbi and his learning became the focus of the survival and flourishing of the Jewish community. And generation after generation raised their young people to learn the Hebrew language, even if it were a foreign tongue to them, even if they spoke Greek or Latin as their mother tongue. They learned Hebrew. They read the books of Moses. They read the Psalms. And they sat at the feet of their teachers, their religious leaders, the rabbis. And they heard expounded the law of Moses, the law of the Sabbath, the law of keeping the God's name holy, and how each generation of rabbis added to this learning, this explanation, the law of the Jews. And it was believed that one day God would reestablish Israel as a great nation. And the rabbis kept this faith alive. And they celebrated the Passover year after year, celebrating and hoping for a new liberation. And they spread all over Europe. Driven out of Spain in 1492 by Ferdinand and Isabella, many Jews went first to Germany and then further on. They went all the way out to Eastern Europe. There they didn't find toleration, really. They weren't Christians. But they found a certain degree of acceptance for the local kings in Poland or dukes of Lithuania. They wanted the Jewish people there as colonists, farming the land, living in towns. Frequently they were forced to live in their own town or a ghetto inside the big town, but there at least they could live and continue their faith. From time to time there'd be savage persecutions of them, but they continued. And their spoken language, replacing Hebrew for these Jews of Eastern Europe, was Yiddish. It is a Germanic dialect based upon the dialects of the Rhine, but written in Hebrew characters. And in and itself became a source of magnificent poetry, became a source of folklore and writing. And Isaac Singer was born into that world. Yiddish was his mother tongue. But like so many others, he sought different ways. In other words, since the 18th century, there had been a strong tendency among many Jewish people to assimilate, to become part of European life, to look with disrespect upon the Yiddish language, to look with disrespect upon those Jews who spent their life doing nothing but studying the past, to become businessmen and successful merchants of all kinds, and to be educated in European fashion, even to convert to Christianity. And Singer grew up and came really to despise what his father represented. In 1935, though, he was wise enough, 33 years of age, to realize that even assimilated Jews, even Jews who had converted to Christianity, were in serious danger. So he left Poland, left his wife and child, and came to the United States. Remarried, but continued to believe that there was still something special about the Yiddish language. It was his language. And he began to write magnificent novels in Yiddish. He would write it in Yiddish, and then it would be translated into English, generally by his nephew. And he won such recognition for these works that he received the Nobel Prize. But one of his most powerful novels, and the novel which I believe he poured his soul into, is The Penitent. The story takes place in 1969, and Singer is the narrator, who then hears the story told by the penitent. The penitent is Joseph Shapiro. But Singer, the narrator, is there in Jerusalem, and he starts off by saying, "This was my first visit to Jerusalem. I had never been there before, and I went to the Wailing Wall." Now here's a Jew who's 67 years of age, but never been to Jerusalem. And he said, I'm there like a tourist, just looking at the Wailing Wall. But 1969, it's an interesting year, because only 2 years before the Israelis had reclaimed Jerusalem. And the final fulfillment of what God had sent to the Israelites as they saw it came when they went back into that city and the Wailing Wall was theirs again. And I was there looking at the Wailing Wall, and a man came up to me. He looked older than he was. If you looked in his eyes, he was somewhat young, but he had a gray beard, dressed in a very orthodox fashion, the black hat, the long coat, no tie. And he said, "Welcome to Jerusalem." I said, "Do I know you?" He said, "Yes, I know you, but you don't know me. I am Joseph Shapiro." And he stuck out his hand to me, and I shook it. And he didn't shake it in the American way, but in the way a rabbi does, soft, not pressing the flesh to overwhelm and dominate you, but just to greet you. And I said, "How do you know me, Mr. Shapiro?" And he said, "I used to hear you all the time in New York. I read all of your books, read every article that you wrote, and I would go with my wife, and we would listen when you lectured. So I knew you right away." "Do you still live in New York?" "No. No, I live here in Jerusalem. And I have a story I think you would like to hear. May I come to your room, to your hotel, and talk to you?" Well, Singer's never met this man before. He says, "Well, why don't you come to lunch?" And Joseph Shapiro says, "No, they don't keep the dietary rules in these Israeli hotels. They say they do, but they don't. But I would come at 3 o'clock and talk to you." It's much like the poem, The Ancient Mariner by Coleridge. The wedding guest, off on a different mission, is suddenly stopped by the ancient mariner and told a tale that can change his whole life. And so Joseph Shapiro comes to Singer. He says, "I want to describe to you what my life has been. I was born," he said, "in Poland, and I went through all the horror of World War II. And at the end of the war, everything was destroyed. Before the war, I'd been very assimilated, and both my girlfriend and I had been serious communists, and we looked upon the Soviet Union as the salvation of the world. And we justified everything that the Soviet Union did. And I had no patience whatsoever with the Jews who let all of this terror come upon them, sitting around reading their Talmud, reading this ancient book of the law, these commentaries on the law of Moses. We called them Talmud Jews. And they were completely unaware of the world, and they had no meaning. What were they doing still studying these ancient books? And so this horror came, and I could find no meaning in it, but I was determined to survive. And with my girlfriend, we made our way across Poland. We had both had a lot of experience, and we didn't judge one another, but we still believed in communism. But once you really saw it in operation, you knew it wasn't right. So I even lost that belief. But we wanted to go to Palestine. We wanted to rebuild an Israel. And we wanted to make it a socialist Israel, not a Talmud Israel, but an Israel where the Jewish people could have a home and be safe, but based on socialistic principles and democracy and the ways of the West. But we couldn't get a visa to Palestine, but we got one to the United States. And we came to New York, and we married. Celia and I married. And we found everything we wanted in New York. We gave up the thought of going to Israel. I went into business. I had nothing, but I had a gift for making real estate deals. And partners came to me and said, "We'll back you." And we developed a flourishing real estate business. I got very rich very fast. And Celia went back to college. All these years, she had dragged her diploma around with her from her Polish university, and now she went to Hunter College and began to study. So she had what she wanted. We weren't able to have any children, but that didn't matter. It didn't matter to us. We had the good life. We had a vacation home, magnificent apartment in New York, and we went to all the plays we wanted to, and my partner said, "Why don't you have a mistress, Joseph?" And I said, "Well, I don't know if I want a mistress. Seems like a lot of trouble." They said, "Every cool person has a mistress. Now, surely you want a mistress." So I got a mistress even. And I think my wife knew about it, but she didn't care. And we went to all the trendy movies with all their sex displayed, and we giggled at it and laughed at it. We were living, in a bold new age where sexuality was everything. So I had money. a girlfriend, big thriving business. But I wasn't happy. My mistress, Lisa, was a very grasping sort. And I knew she was working me for every bit of money she could get out of me. She had this terrible daughter who was what we called in those days a hippie. And she had this dreadful boyfriend with a beard, and he questioned everything that the country stood for. But they were always there, leeching off of me. And Lisa, my mistress, was always coming up with some new scheme by which I would give more money to her daughter and give more money to her. One night I was there. I'd lied to my wife. I said I wasn't coming home. I couldn't come home. We had a business deal out in Long Island, but I would stay in a hotel. Well, of course, I went to Lisa, my mistress, and she cooked the meal for me that I liked. Then we were in bed, and there was a beating on the door, and it was her daughter. And the daughter began to berate her mother. The daughter wanted money for who knows what terrible purpose, and her mother said, "No, I'm not going to help you destroy yourself." And the daughter said to her mother, slapping her, "Why, you old whore, you've got 2 boyfriends yourself." Now, see, I can cheat on my wife. I thought, but you mean my mistress has a boyfriend? This is terrible. So I immediately became totally disgusted, and I fled out the door, went home, knocked on the door because the door was locked in a strange way. I couldn't get it open. And after a long time, my wife came to the door very embarrassed looking. And she said, "Why don't you wait a few minutes?" I said, "What do you mean? Well, it's my house. I want to come in." She said, "Why don't you wait just a little bit?" There was my wife's professor in my bed, that wizened old fool, and my wife was sleeping with him. So she had betrayed me. I was like some fool in a comic opera out there beating on my own door to get in. Well, I had had it. I went out into the night, into the cold night with nothing except my wallet in my pocket, stuffed as always, full of money. I got a cab and I said, "Just take me to some hotel." And I went and spent the night. My life was a shambles. I had nothing. Woke up that next morning, went down to eat breakfast. I said, "I'm going to have ham and eggs today." And then I saw this man next to me stuffing his face with ham. And I thought, suddenly, I've eaten meat all my life. It's one of my great gourmet delights. Why does some animal suffer and die so that fat people can eat it? There are other things to eat in the world than meat and fish. It is killing. And I decided right then that every person who eats meat is a Nazi, inflicting all this pain upon creatures. So I, from that moment, became a vegetarian. Well, I know vegetarianism isn't part of Judaism. In fact, many Orthodox Jews believe that vegetarianism is some trendy idea, and God has condoned by special dietary laws the eating of flesh. But I would never eat meat or fish again. And I couldn't stand it there where I was in that hotel. And something inside me, I thought it was just chance. But I have come to understand with my Jewish brothers that nothing is chance. God is behind everything. Something just said to me, go down to the Lower East Side, to the very Jewish center of New York. And there I found all these shops selling prayer shawls, bookstores with ancient books in Hebrew and Yiddish, the writings of Maimonides and of learned rabbis that I had not heard of since my father told me about them so long ago. And I dismissed them all. And I was walking around wondering what to do with myself. And an elderly man, shabbily dressed, but in his prayer shawl, came up to me and said, "Would you become the 10th member of our prayer group? We must have prayer, and we must have 10 members, as you know. We only have 9. Our faithful comrade is ill today." I said, "I don't have a prayer shawl." He said, "We'll give you one." I said, "I'm not a good Jew anymore." "That doesn't matter. You can still pray. God will listen." So I went with them into this building that should have been condemned. Dark room, but it was like the room of my youth. There were all the old books of the law, of the Talmud. There was the Torah. There were benches. And the elderly men there all wore their skull caps and their prayer shawls. And suddenly I found the voice. I began to pray again. The rabbi came in, an old man, very ill. He pressed my hand, not hard and dominating, but just gently. And it was as though I'd known him forever. We prayed. And when it was done, one of his friends said, "You need to see a doctor to the rabbi. You're very ill." And his wife came in with bread and wine and said, "No, he's not going to the doctor. Take him to those doctors, they'll do those tests on him, and then they'll kill him." And they were right, I said. Doctors just use you as a guinea pig. They don't care about you at all. And the old man would live his length of life, trust in the Lord. And I suddenly decided at that very moment, I'm going to Israel. I'd never been there before. And I'm going to turn my back on all of this. And I flew to Israel. While my partners were outraged. I was leaving behind a flourishing business. My lawyer said, "You've got to divorce your wife before you do this. She'll take everything you got if you don't." I didn't care. But I was flying over on the plane. And it was as though I were being tempted. This beautiful young American Jew sat down beside me. And she immediately seemed to find me attractive. And she began to talk about her life, all her boyfriends, and the free sexual life that she led, and smiled at me through her stained teeth from smoking cigarettes. And she tried to have sex there on the plane as we flew over. And at first I was tempted, and then I was just disgusted. And then I arrived in Israel. What was I going to do in Israel? Well, the airport was a great disappointment to me. The signs were in Hebrew, and they spoke Hebrew, but it was a modern language, filled with English words. It wasn't the word of the Torah. Then I went to a kibbutz, and I found that though they were Jewish, they had not given up their socialism. They may have taken down their portraits of Stalin, but they were still just as secular as the Soviet Union was. So what was I to do with myself? I was here in Israel. I had no connection with it whatsoever. I found a few old friends that I had known in Poland. They were kind to me, but I had nothing much to say to them. Here I was, an American. But then I walked the old quarter of Jerusalem, and once again an old man came out to me and asked if I would be part of the prayer group. Then he took me inside, asked me to eat. His wife laid before me a dish of fish. And I said, "I can't eat that." And the rabbi said, "But you're allowed to eat meat." And I said, "No, I'm a vegetarian. That is your way." He introduced me to his daughter, Sarah. Remember Sarah? Along with Abraham, her husband, the founder of the Israeli nation, the Israelites. And Sarah was beautiful. Oh, the world might have not have thought her beautiful, but she was beautiful to me. And I knew right then that I was going to marry her. And I got my divorce. My wife indeed took almost everything I had, but I didn't care. I was free. And so we're married now. Joseph, remember, who had to go into Egypt to find himself, cast into the pit by his brothers. Joseph Shapiro and Sarah. And we're married. We have children, which I had never had before. And I spend my time studying. I'm a student now. And I spend all my days reading the book of Moses, reading the Psalms. I spend my days studying the Talmud. I speak as much as possible only in Hebrew. And I have found my way by going back to everything that I rejected. I want nothing to do, he said, with your civilization, your secularism. It is my way. I do not force it on anybody. But I ask you questions like this. What do you gain from your lives? All the money that you have. Money drives everything. Universities, churches, they are all about getting money. How many letters will you get today in the mail from your old college wanting a donation? You'll get telemarketing calls from them. You never hear from them except, "Give us money." And the amount of raising money even by a politician is the sign of success. But money does not make a better school. Children do not learn any more in an elaborate lecture hall with the most elaborate technology. The mind is a sacred thing, not to be bought. And Joseph continued, and the poison of your society. How many people start the day by reading the newspaper? Or we could say by turning on the television news. What a way to begin your day. It is nothing, Joseph Shapiro tells Singer, but poison, murders, mayhem, treachery. It is like a poison that drips upon your brain. And you get dripped that way in the morning, then you get another dose of poison. Look at those little things that flitter by on the television news screen underneath. You know, those little sound bites? They're so horrible, the things that they just report in a sound bite. The murders, disasters. That poison drops upon you. Then early in the evening, you get another dose of poison. And you can't go to bed unless you listen to the news one more time and get another dose of poison. You don't need newspapers or news. All the wisdom is inside you. So money, the news, all of these are meaningless. And then your technology. Do you really know more because you can look things up on the internet? Now, he didn't have the internet in '69, but do we know more because of the internet? Pull up the internet and you go through entry after entry that you don't even want to turn on, or your email. I think of Henry David Thoreau, much like the Penitent, who found his own way, who said that of all the letters I have gotten in my life, maybe 2 of them were worth the postage. How much more true is that of email? The Penitent says, I don't need technology. I don't reject it. I just don't build my life around it. I wouldn't need, he would say if he lived today, a BlackBerry, a cell phone. I don't need to stay connected because I am connected to God. And science, the Penitent says, what has that brought you except suffering? The best account of the beginning of the world I have ever read is Genesis. That makes the most sense to me. That means the most to me that God created the heavens and the earth, and that there is a plan for everything, and that he is eternal in perfection, just the way the Talmud tells us. The silliest thing is the Big Bang Theory, as though the world just came into being by an accident, all its perfection. I see no reason to study science. I see no reason to have technology dominate your lives. I see no reason to be connected to a world filled with poison. So I have found my life, my way, right here in Jerusalem. I am a penitent. That means one who has returned to the faith. All these years I was looking for it. A Christian, far removed from his or her church, would turn back to their God. This is my God. And I will hold him and I will cherish him. And I will know that my soul is immortal. That I have gone through all these personal sufferings for a reason. The same way the people of Israel went through all their sufferings for a reason. Now, I'm not wise enough to understand it, but I know God sent you here to me, and for me to see you here at the Wailing Wall, to bring you this message. And so I am on God's business. And now I will go back, sit back down with my Talmud, knowing that every time I read it, I come into closer contact with my God, that my soul is refreshed and purified, and that I can devote my life to what truly matters, to living the life that God in all his mercy has chosen for me. And so the penitent went away. And Singer wrote this tale. Once again, not for everybody to force them to do this, but to make each one of us ponder at each stage of our life. How did we come to be there? Where we should go afterwards. And to realize we can always change.